Tonight I am still in San Francisco. It's Friday night, the night before Fleet Week, and I am at a place called Swissnex, Swiss organization that helps bridge startups between Switzerland and the US, in this case San Francisco specifically here. They have a beautiful location right by the water, Pier 17 in San Francisco, and they invited me to come speak at their Swissnex Salon, which is an art exhibition that starts today and will last for about 2 months. And come here and talk a bit about how digitalization and software and technology has enabled me to live a life without too many things in my life. I have a big weakness, and I have a big weakness for questions that on the surface might sound very simple. But a lot of those had quite the impact on my life, and I want to tell you about a few of those. So back in September 2016, roughly 2 years and a month ago, I woke up one morning and for some reason this question was in my head: do I need a home? I had just come back from New York the night before from a business trip, and I was going to go back to the airport to fly to Amsterdam. And I realized I had basically only come back to Zurich, where I was living at the time, because I felt like if I'm paying for this place and it has all these nice couches and pillows and knives and everything in it, I might as well use it. But then in that moment when I got up, I realized things should always be there for me and not the other way around. Like, it does not make sense for me to spend time on maintaining my flat if I feel it's a one-way street. And so that was the moment when I said goodbye to having a home. I packed my bag. This is everything I own. Packed my bag and left my place. And for the past more than 2 years, I have not stopped. I have not ever had a constant home since then. If you were to describe my life in a few numbers, there's a few numbers that stand out. Number one is probably 64. Back then when I moved out, that was the number of things that fit into my backpack. Right now it's about 59. Another number that deviates from the average is 3 days. That's the number of days I spent on average in the same place last year. If you look at it on a map, it was roughly 120 flights. I covered about 80% of the distance between Earth and Moon. And of course, the one question is why? Why live such a crazy lifestyle without a home, without the comfort of having your own bed? And I want to tell you a few anecdotes of how it came to be and why that's the way I've been living the last few years. So the first anecdote is titled, "What Makes Me Happy?" This is where I've lived and worked over the past 10 years. I was born and raised in Switzerland. I studied at ETH Zurich and in Hong Kong. And I've lived and worked for the first few years after I turned 18 or 19, I've lived in New York, Hong Kong, Berlin, Paris, and a few more places. And I was always interested in startups. From the very beginning, I started my first company when I was 14. And I really liked this phase of going from 0 to 1, of creating something sustainable from nothing, or a discussion, a few drinks at a bar, and an idea that had come up. And the only exception that I made was when I was like roughly 24 years old. I went to London and I decided to go and take a job. Because I figured I only know the startup life, so maybe there's something else on the other end of the spectrum that I might like even more. And big mistake, I went into investment banking and did a technology project. And I'll spare you all the details, but I think this emoji describes pretty well what I've seen there. And I've arrived and I was so frustrated because I realized there were such smart and driven and motivated people around me, but they never took the time to ask themselves one question, which was, what is it that makes me happy? And if you think about it, like, it's such a simple question and it's such a fundamental question because we're all driven by what makes us happy. We all, in the end, we don't want to be, that's a thesis, but I don't think we want to be rich. I don't think we want to drive fancy cars. I think in the end, we want to be happy. We want to get up. We want to be happy when we get up, and we want to be happy when we go back to bed. And so it's interesting. I finished my project after 4 months instead of 6 and got out of there. And that was one of my big takeaways, to think about what is it that makes me happy. And the question wouldn't leave my mind. So for the next 4 to 6 months after my banking experience, I tried to observe myself. Whenever I felt happy, I tried to figure out what was it that triggered that feeling. And one thing that I realized for myself is that there's a number of things, but the dominant one was I am happy when I learn. I am happy when I understand contexts, systems, concepts, how the world works. And especially applied to a particular area of my life, which was building companies. So going from something that was like little and tiny, just an idea, to something that is sustainable and works by itself and continues on itself. And so at that point, it was really easy for me to optimize everything in my life for that one goal, to learn as much about that process as possible. And what I started doing is getting myself involved in as many interesting projects as possible. It started out with this company, MediaSign, which was an advertising agency. That was the company that I started when I was 14 and actually sold last week. And then it continued on my journey to Berlin and Zurich and Zug, where I became part of a few projects. And then, of course, at some point, I got over to the US and I discovered a whole new world where things seemed possible that in Switzerland, at least at the time, were not possible in terms of how crazy can you think? How crazy can the ideas be and still get funding? And how crazy are the bets that investors and entrepreneurs are taking? And then there's one more company, Zendesk, which I wrote Planet Earth, and we'll get back to this later, but that kind of mimics my lifestyle as a company. And once I've realized that if I want to expose myself to all these ideas and these great people that I can learn so much from, and being able to expose myself to different situations, different cultures that all planted ideas in my head on what to build next and how to build it, I realized I have to be traveling most of the time to expose myself to that many ideas. And that's how I made the decision to leave my home a bit more than a couple of years ago. The second anecdote I want to share with you is titled White Betting. Another question that came up way before I started traveling that much was, how much stuff do I own? Hands up, who here thinks they could accurately answer that question? How much?
One van full.
Okay, and you?
Less than a carload.
Less than a carload, cool. But for me, back then, when this question first came up in my life, I was 22, 23, I had moved around a few places. And I've already figured I don't own too much stuff. But at the same time, I had no idea whether that meant I owned 200 things or 2,000 or even more things. And being the left-brained person that I am, what's the logical next step? I started creating a spreadsheet. I started going through my apartment and everything in my life and started indexing it, giving it a title, taking a note about what brand and make it was, how many. And also I find it interesting to collect how much cost there was. And then it became a game. So back then it was roughly 650 or 700 things that I owned, which was impressive to me because at the time I already thought I had kind of a lean or light footprint because I had been traveling a lot. So how did I get from those 400? So after I first clean out, I got down to about 400. And how did I get back down, or how did I get to the 64 that would eventually fit into my bag when I left my place? One system that I use is this, I call it the 1990 day process or thinking or assertion. And I'll talk a bit more about why 90 is such an important number in my life. But what I do basically is every 90 days, I look at this list. Now that I had a spreadsheet, it was much easier to keep track of like what was added and what went from it. And I ask myself, what are the things that I haven't used in the past 90 days and I'm most likely not going to use in the next 90 days? So I feel in 90 days, I have somewhat of an idea of what's going to happen in the next 90 days. And also, if you think about it, a half a year covers a lot of situations in your life. There's warm days, cold days, there's days where you want to do sports, there's formal days, weddings, family events. So if you're not going to need something within 180 days, there's a very small chance you're ever going to need it again. And what I did after that is, because what I found so interesting is how, even though I would call myself a very rational person, I had developed emotions for a lot of the stuff that I owned. It was very hard for me to just give stuff away. Even if I knew I hadn't touched this shirt or this pair of pants, in probably 2 years and probably wouldn't even fit in it. It was hard for me to give it away. There was always this like afterthought, maybe I'll need it someday. And so what helped me to get over that is what I did is I would just put that stuff into a bag, put it into a corner at my parents' place, and then coming back 90 days after, and time for time realizing that I had never once gone back to that bag and picked anything out of it was so liberating. Because I realized I can give it away and someone else is going to get more value from it than I do, because for me it was just a dust collector. And then of course that's something that I also started applying to my office setup, where I had so many files and different laptops and data space, and then I won't go into the details, but it's been such a liberating process for me. But then we all like to give gifts, right? We all like to, we live in a culture, at least in my family and my friends, we celebrate Christmas, or let's say the holidays, birthdays, anniversaries, and so on and so forth. And for the first roughly 23, 24 years of my life, I would very often get something physical, which as soon as I realized I could not carry it with me anyway, this quote really started to resonate with me. Presence is the best present. So I started telling people in my family or my loved ones that if they wanted to gift me something, give me time, give me an experience, give me something that I can take anywhere. And it's been one of the best decisions of my life. There's so many seemingly simple but deep moments that I've collected instead of having things that can break. Stuff as simple as spending an evening with my sister and cooking together instead of her gifting me an iPad that I cannot really bring anywhere anyway. So if you look closely at a previous slide, you might notice that there's a pretty boring or almost unnecessary column here saying color. I only own 2 things that are not black, which are my 2 Swiss passports. So you can get if you travel a certain amount, you can get 2 passports. You can have one sent in for visas and the other one for your current travel. But the more important question is why black? Who has an idea why everything I own and where? It doesn't get dirty. So I used to say that, and I was very quickly corrected that it doesn't look dirty as quickly, but it still does get dirty. Who has another idea?
It's coordinated.
It's what?
It's a coordinated.
It looks formal, everything fits together. I never need to make a decision whether I'm going to wear the black pants with the white shirt or the green shirt. Yeah? Yes?
Like a service worker instead of a tourist.
Say once more?
Look like a service worker instead of a tourist.
I was actually asked, so these shirts that I wear are also pretty pragmatic because it's easier to iron them without an actual color. But there's been several instances at a place like this where I was asked if I could bring another beer because people thought I was waitressing. Someone.
You look fantastic in black.
Ah, thank you. So there's a few more practical reasons. One of them being when I started eliminating all the things that took unnecessary attention, I also started to eliminate all unnecessary decisions from my life because I believe that it always takes a little bit of brain power that I could otherwise invest instead of a decision that is not really necessary or essential to my well-being. And so black just happens to be the default color for everything. So once I decide I need a Fitbit, usually there's a black version, so there's one less decision I need to make. And if you remember the title of this anecdote, I often stay in hotels and Airbnbs, and it's much harder to lose a black shirt on white bedding than a white shirt. Sit-ups and push-ups. So everyone get up, we'll do a bit fit. I'm just kidding, I'm just kidding. All right, who here has ever made New Year's resolutions? No, that's the second question, so I want to see the hands go up first. And who's been able to keep them? Yes. I found it a pretty frustrating experience. Beginning of, I don't know which year it was, but I was up on January 1st, and I was like, all right, this year is going to be so different. I'll leave my baggage with all my old problems back in the last year, and this year I'm going to be fit, and I'm eating healthy, and I'm starting 3 new companies, and I'm going to be a better boyfriend, and so on and so forth. And end of January, I was still going to the gym every day. February, I maybe skipped every second day. March, I kind of tried to convince myself that I only made half of those promises, and then in April, it was kind of over. I didn't like that, because I liked that energy that January 1st planted in me, that kind of like, all right, it's a new start, let's go and do it. And so I started to think about that process. Why is that I cannot turn this positive energy into something better? And what I realized for myself is just 12 months, 365 days, it's just way too far down the line. I have no idea where I'm going to be in 365 days, how I'm going to be feeling, and what my priorities are. And that's when the number 90 or 91 became more important in my life. And I decided to, instead of set annual goals, to just set quarterly goals. And I started doing this process, what I call my 90-day review and preview process. And it's pretty simple. I sit down every 90 days and I write an email to my future self. Now, you could use a service for this. You could, of course, just use a notes application, or you could use a task manager, whatever fits your needs. And I start writing, and I write about 12 areas of my life. So at that point also, I ask myself, I kind of interviewed myself, which is weird, but no one was watching, so I asked myself, if I had to describe to someone what does my life look like if I had to describe it in areas, what would those areas be? And I came up with these 12. Now, they do change over time. What works for me might not work for you, but I think it's also an interesting question to think about. If you had to explain your life to me in areas, what would it be? So you see here, there's a lot of, I try to be very wholesome. I try to cover social aspects, monetary aspects, fitness, health, and so on and so forth. And then what I do in my review, so I have this email and I write down these 12 areas of my life, and I start writing and I ask myself a bunch of questions. Again, this is usually when no one's looking. And for example, for friends, I ask myself a bunch of questions. The first one is, how do I feel about this area of my life? Again, I think in the end, we all just want to be happy. So I think it's important for me to kind of become clean with myself about, is there something that's been on my mind for a while that's kind of bothering me, but that I haven't taken the time to actually look into and face? And then I try to have a set of questions for each area that helps me analyze if I'm being true to myself, or expose potential vulnerabilities or areas where I should make a change. So here's a bunch of questions. I'm going to pick one of them. For example, who have I not spent enough time with? Something that's very important to me because I'm away very often. My family, my parents, my sister, my fiance, they live in Switzerland. So it's important for me to ask myself, like, am I in line with the priorities I want to have in my life? Do I spend enough time with the people that I value and love in my life? And I write it down. So that usually takes me about 2 to 3 hours. And it's not an easy process, and I kind of push it every time, so I'm not exactly doing it at the end of the quarter, but usually within the first week of the next quarter, I do find the time. And then 90 days after, what happens is I get an email back. And I get an email back showing me black and white what I felt like and what I felt what was bothering me at the time and what I was happy with. And that concludes the review part. There's a second part to that email, which is the preview part, looking forward. And in the preview part, that's kind of taken over what I used to do with New Year's resolutions. So I set 1 or 2 things that I'm going to change within the next quarter. Now, it doesn't sound like a lot, but it allows me to focus on ideally just one thing that I'm going to change within the next 90 days. And it helps me to achieve that. I make it very measurable. For example, let's go back to the example with, do I spend enough time with someone that I love? So my sister's a great example. We're very different, like day and night. And I realized there was a certain disconnect between the two of us. We had kind of fallen out of touch. And so one change that I've made for the next 90 days, every day I would think of her and send her a message. And it's been such a positive change in both of our lives because we feel a lot more connected as brothers and sisters, even though we don't spend that much time together. It's very measurable. Every day I could tell whether I did it or not, and it didn't take me a lot of time, but it's brought so many good emotions and so much good change to my life. Another change that I've made, and I guess not everyone here is local and might also travel a lot. When I started traveling a lot, at the beginning, it always felt like as soon as I sat down in the airplane and I left Zurich Airport or wherever I was living, it felt like I was going on vacation. And what do I do on vacation? I don't work out, I don't eat healthy, I don't get enough sleep. Now, I think that's fine if you go on vacation twice a year, but if you're on 120 flights per year, suddenly the days that I would spend not on vacation mode were like down to a few months. And at the same time, I had all these excuses, right? I couldn't get a gym membership for the 12 places that I was visiting within the next few months. Being between India and Australia and Singapore and Miami, all within 2 weeks, meant I couldn't just go for the one same healthy meal every day, and I had to constantly pick something. And so I thought about that. How am I going to fix that? How am I going to be more healthy? And there's two simple choices that I came up with. One is I do a lot of sit-ups and push-ups. There's never sit-ups, push-ups, and squats. There's never an excuse not to do push-ups because you barely need like 2 square meters. Same for squats. And if you do it first time in the morning, 30 minutes, you can get quite a few of them done. And I get exhausted. I usually do about 300 of them each every morning, and it does get me pretty worked out. And the second rule that I try to adopt is very often if I feel I'm not eating healthy by default, I just leave everything out that has carbs in it. Bread, anything sugary, and so on. And yeah, that's just 2 months of the year. Alrighty, that's the 90-day review and preview process. And the fourth anecdote I want to share with you starts like a bad joke. A Russian, an Armenian, a Macedonian, a Hungarian, and a Swiss walk into a bar. The idea here was, once I got accustomed to my lifestyle and this review process and being on the run all the time, being on the run or on the road all the time. Yeah. That's why I need 2 passports, because I'm not actually. So the idea originated in a different company called Zendesk, but we've now shifted focus into this company called DFINITY. DFINITY is it's one of these blockchain decentralized infrastructure startups that kind of brings the Wikipedia or Wikimedia idea to the infrastructure layer. So you're not dependent anymore on a server provider or a domain provider and so on. I won't go too deep. We'll have time for questions afterwards, so if anyone's interested, we can dive into that. But we built Zendesk in a completely decentralized way. There were originally 13 people working with me from 12 different countries before we shifted into DFINITY. And I just want to share a few notes of what went well and what didn't go too well with that. The question that sparked it was also, does a company need an office? And if you think about it, I'm sure all of us have different experiences. We're all involved in different jobs, different businesses, and it might work very differently for different types of businesses. And there's a few obvious cons and pros. The pros might be you save electricity and you save infrastructure costs, and everyone has a lot more flexibility. Because my personal experience is I'm not always productive from 6 a.m. in the morning till 10 p.m. Very often it's like I'm either early in the day and productive or late night or vice versa. And I wanted my employees or people I work with to have a similar experience and freedom. But there's also obvious downsides, right? We all value our coworkers and the culture that we have because we meet them at the water cooler, and that's when we talk about which movie did you watch last night and how do you think about it? That's not something we bring up via email or Slack or any sort of instant messenger. But we decided to run the experiment and see if we can circumvent these downsides and turn them into a positive. And so the good thing is, this is how my office usually looks. It's just my laptop. Very often it's also in a plane sitting on my lap. And all I really need to be productive is Wi-Fi and electricity. And luckily, you can get that in most places of the world, although that's also been a bit of a challenge sometimes, getting decent Wi-Fi still. Just a few lessons I've learned from this. Like being away from my team for most of the time has allowed me to do one thing really well, which is focus on the important versus the urgent. What I've realized is if I sit in the same office as all my team, it's so easy for them to come over and tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, can you help me with this? Can you do this for me? Can you explain me how this works? And while at the beginning it might look like a slow start because we have to document everything and there's a bit of an overhead in creating all these systems and processes, what I've learned is it's extremely easy to onboard people afterwards once you've created that documentation. Another thing that I've learned is that my role as a leader is really only 2 things. One is to be a pilot and make sure the ship is going the right direction, we stay on path. And the other thing is to create a good work environment for everyone I work with, to create the best possible foundation for them so they can be successful. And very important, I talked about culture, but for me, building a company is always about the company you're building with. I think there's no great ideas, there's no great markets, there's only great teams. In the end, for me, that's all that matters. With my past experience, when something failed, it was always because of the team, and when something succeeded, it was always because of the team. And so the way we battle or we work with that is, well, usually this is how we work and meet. Every 3 months, so another 90 days usually, we bring everyone together and we work from one place. In this instance here, we were in Armenia, and during that week when we work together, we focus on all the long-term stuff. We define roadmap. We make sure everyone knows what they're going to be doing the next 12 weeks. And then the other half of the day, we focus on getting to know each other. And we do fun stuff like hiking or, well, the other thing, I also took them surprise skydiving. So one afternoon I said, we're going to go and picnic. And we drove to the airport and everyone got on a plane and we jumped out. It was extremely fun for me. Not everyone liked it as much. So the next time we decided to go hiking instead. All right, and I'm almost at the end. So this is a quote that has really inspired me. The secret of happiness is not found in seeking more, but in developing the capacity to enjoy less. Well, I think in other words, to just value what we have and make the best out of it. And while it might sound very applicable to my lifestyle of owning very few things, what surprised me is who said this, or wrote this, I guess. It was Socrates a few hundred years before Christ. And with that, I think we have time for questions, and thank you all for paying attention.
Thank you very much, Cédric. I think it raises a lot of questions. Unfortunately, we have also other breakout sessions which are